Welcome back, everyone, to more NASCAR Heat 3 coverage here at Knee Pit Gaming. Today's setup video takes us back to the Superspeedways, the restrictor plate track of Talladega SuperSpeedway. And the goal here for this video, we'll be talking about all three of the top series between trucks, Xfinity, and the Monster Energy Cup cars. And of course, we'll be talking about setups, we'll be talking about lap times, and all of that sort of thing that we normally do. But the theme here was really to do something different than I did at Daytona. What I did at Daytona, those setups work perfectly fine here at Talladega. So it's not a question of making them better, it's just a question of making them different. And then you can choose among the different styles and see which ones feel better and work better for you. So with that in mind, let's head to the track. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started with the trucks. But before we do that, let's talk about a couple of things related to the track and so on. The track itself, of course, in all three series can be run wide open. Even when you're in traffic, you can choose to lift or you can choose to drag the brake. So you've got a lot of options here at this particular track. Now, the AI like to hug that double yellow line all the way around the track, particularly in the trucks. It's not quite as bad in the other two series, but particularly in the trucks, it is really interesting racing when they hug the yellow lines all the way around the track. So keep that in mind when you're going to be racing against them. It can make it very hard to move forward on the bottom line because basically you're going to have to wait for somebody to slip up and move off the bottom, or you can sort of root and gouge them out of the way if you decide that you want to do that. Also, speed rating really means nothing at this track, just like it didn't at Daytona. And the reason is your fastest laps by far will be run in the draft. So really you're at the mercy of where you are in the pack and what kind of runs you're getting on the cars in front of you and what kind of cars you have behind you and how strong they are and how many are in line and all that kind of thing. So you're really at the mercy of the AI as far as what kind of lap times you're going to run, because your times in the draft here in the three series will be anywhere from a second to about a second and a half faster than what you can run by yourself. So again, you're sort of at the mercy for those. So don't worry a whole lot about that. In fact, in two of the three series, I'm only at a 104 speed rating because I couldn't get the AI to go fast enough, even on maximum difficulty, to get me to the 105. So the one I actually made it to 105 speed rating was Xfinity. So that's, take that for whatever it's worth. So let's go ahead and move on very briefly to lap times. And we'll talk about lap times in all three series, but we'll start with the trucks. In the trucks, these setups are not really fine-tuned for single lap speed or qualifying speed. So the main thing you'll want to do for sure is play around with the rear end ratio and the gearing whenever you're doing qualifying versus the race, because you're going to be running such a different range of RPM during the race than you would run in the qualifying. So play around with the rear end ratio if you want that single car speed, but these are basically tuned more for race situations. In the trucks, I'm running anywhere from like a 52.8 or 52.9, somewhere in that range, alone on the track under qualifying conditions. So not terribly fast. That's going to get you just outside the top 20, or at least it did for me, somewhere around 20th place. So you're not going to qualify at the front with that. Again, we're talking about maximum difficulty AI here. They are extremely fast in all three series in qualifying for the most part. So keep that in mind and get ready to race and really have to be patient working your way up through the field. Now, with setups in the trucks, we're going to be looking at something a little bit different from the trucks to Xfinity and then finally with Cup. So in addition to doing something a little different than I did at Daytona, I also wanted to do something different in each of the three series, just a little bit different. Same basic idea, but a little bit different to suit each car. We'll start off with the shocks, and this is something that I found no reason to change. Everything worked really fine with the 3-5 combination of bump and rebound, so feel free to play around with that if you so desire. Moving on to the weight settings, maximum left side weight, but then the front weight and wedge are quite a bit different than what they were at Daytona. Both of these for the truck are at 53%. This was to increase stability. This was to really make a stable platform for racing, because I knew that the traffic here is extremely tight, particularly in the trucks with the way they hug the bottom all the way around the track. So you're going to need a good handling car, but you're going to need a very stable car. So that's why I chose to go that direction with the front weight and the wedge. Moving on to the springs, I prefer 1,200 pounds in both of the front springs here because I like a really stiff platform. And then if you notice in the rear of the car, 500 pounds in the left rear, 600 pounds in the right rear. Again, a stiffer platform. But I also wanted to make sure the car would rotate, and the stiffer overall rear springs will help to accomplish that. Now, only 100 pounds of rear spring split, which is a little bit more, I believe, than I used at Daytona. But again, just a different style of setup, so keep that in mind. If you want the rear end of the car to work a little bit less and in the car to be a little bit tighter, then one of your options is to lower both of the rear springs and try out something like 400 on the left rear, 500 in the right rear, or even softer than that will certainly do the trick. Now, tire settings, by far the fastest is to run maximum 50 pounds on all four tires. That's not the most comfortable. So if you're looking for comfort, then you're going to be somewhere from 25 to 27 pounds on the left sides and 32 to 34, 35 pounds on the right sides. So keep that in mind, but it will be slower than using maximum tire pressures all around. On the miscellaneous settings, maximum front camber, because that's where you get the most grip in this game, and there's no reason not to do it, other than if you just simply don't like the feel of the car there. Feel free to drop that down to really any number you want to. Drop it down, try +2 on the left front and -2 on the right front. That will certainly be very stable and a lot tighter of a car. The car won't want a rotate or turn near as much by using that. So feel free to mess around with that. But again, it just doesn't have as much grip. Front sway bar is at my basically standard 1.15 inches. So really nothing to mess around with there. That felt perfectly fine. And then you notice that the track bar is maxed out. 15 inches on both sides. That's really to accompany the front weight and the wedge. Using higher numbers there means that I can use a higher track bar as well as some different rear springs. So that's where that come from. Brake bias anywhere from 70 to 75 seems to work perfectly fine for me. So that's really not a significant thing. You might be dragging the brakes some when you're in traffic, but other than that, you're really not going to be using them to any great degree until you get to green flag pit stop. So that's really what you want to adjust the brake bias for whenever you get there. The grill tape, 65%, but you can certainly, if memory serves me correct, again, I don't pay a whole lot of attention to this particular setting because it does nothing to help me as it should, but it would be nice if it worked even close to what it does in real life, but it has no difference whatsoever. So I tried to get it at least fairly good, just in case they release a patch at some point that makes it actually have a function. But 65% seems to work pretty good. As long as you don't get the car overheating with the oil temp, then you'll be perfectly fine on that. Wheel lock is at 10 degrees. I don't really want to have to turn the wheel a whole lot. I don't want quick reactions from the wheel. I just want slow and steady from my steering. Steering offset is at 0.10, and that is to offset the pull to the left from using maximum front camber. So if you do decide to choose and reduce the front camber, then you'll want to reduce the steering offset as well. Otherwise, you can, at some point, if you get the steering offset out of line with your camber numbers, then you can actually introduce a pull to the right on the straightaway. So keep that in mind. And then finally, we get down to the gear settings. Not a whole lot to talk about first through fourth gear, but the rear end ratio, there is a lot of adjustability there. I'm using a 294, but you could easily use a 3.0, maybe even a 307, or maybe even go down a little bit lower to a 286. I mean, you've got a whole bunch of options here, just depending on what you're trying to set the car up for. The higher number you're using on the rear end ratio, the more RPMs you're going to run. And at some point, when you get closer to about 8,500, which is the rev limiter here in the trucks, then you'll start to run out of the power band, and your speed will actually not be what it would be with running a little bit lower RPM. So keep that in mind. I like to generally stay somewhere around 7,500 RPMs. That seems to be a fairly good range. You can get a little bit above that or below that, but 7,500 seems to be a general rule of thumb. But again, if you want to maximize qualifying speed, that alone speed on the track where a single car speed is important to you, then play around with the rear end ratio for sure, and that can use to pick up some speed. So that'll do it for the trucks. Next, let's move to Xfinity. Before we get into the setup discussion itself, let's talk briefly about the lap times. Once again, you're going to be qualifying toward the back in the second half of the field here. The qualifying time for me is somewhere around a 51.9, maybe 51.8, somewhere in that range. And again, that's going to put you toward the back of the field. I think I qualified like in the low 20s, like 28, 27, 29, somewhere in that range. So definitely not a good starting spot. And I was nearly a full second off the pole. So keep that in mind when you're looking at single car speed. But again, these setups are built for racing and not for qualifying. So now let's jump into the setup itself. And same thing with the shocks that we looked at with the trucks. The 3.5 setup between bump and rebound works perfectly fine for me. No reason to really adjust that for me. Then we move into one of the few differences here. Most of the setup you'll notice is identical to what we saw in the trucks, but there are a couple of differences that I do want to point out. And one of those is in the nose weight or the front weight. It's at 54% instead of 53%. And the reason for that is we're going a little bit faster, and I wanted a little bit more nose weight to keep the car stable. So you can play around with the nose weight, but basically that's there for stability and keeping the car from getting loose on entry or exit. Now, springs are the same, tire settings are the same. And then we get over to track bar. You notice that's the same. Camber is the same. Brake bias is even the same. But grill tape is a little bit different. I usually use about 5% less tape as I move up through the series. So if I start out with 60% on the trucks, I think I'm actually using 65 here. Then I would drop that 5% for the Xfinity and another 5 or 10% for the Cup cars. Again, if this actually did what it was supposed to do, then I would be much more specific about this setting. But since it doesn't, I don't worry a whole lot with it. And then the final difference here is in the gear setting. I'm using a little bit more of a gearing ratio, a little bit higher gearing ratio at 3.0 as opposed to the 294 gear that we saw in the trucks. But again, plenty of adjustability there to go up or down on the rear end ratio, just depending on whether you're trying to get more qualifying speed or you're interested in better performance sucking up in the draft or anything like that. So that will determine ultimately what rear end ratio you want to use, but 3.0 should get you started in the right direction. That'll do it for Xfinity. Now let's move on to Cup. All right, let's get started with a discussion of lap times very briefly in the Cup car. So the Cup AI are actually the worst of the three series, which was a little odd to me. I wasn't expecting that, but the Cup cars are so much faster than the other two series. Maybe that has something to do with it, but I qualified around a 48.6, 48.7, somewhere in that range, and that actually had me in the top 15, which was very surprising to me. I was expecting to be toward the back, just like with the trucks or Xfinity, or at best mid-pack. So a little bit better qualifying performance in the Cup cars, a little bit closer to the front. In fact, I wasn't too terribly far off the pole. I was either 2 or 3 tenths of a second off the pole. So if you're interested in something like that, maybe you want to play around with the setup and go for more single car speed and see if you can get closer to that pole. But for me, it was all about racing, and I was, as I mentioned, really surprised at how well it qualified versus the AI. Moving on to the setup itself. Shock settings, 3.5, stays just like it was from the previous two discussions. Then we move on to the weight settings, and here you notice that I'm using maximum front weight and maximum wedge. As I mentioned, these cars are a good bit faster than the other two series, so I wanted to make sure we had maximum stability in the cars, and the cars handled and did what they needed to do. Springs, not looking at any changes, same thing with the tires. But as I mentioned, keep in mind that if you want to use more conventional tire numbers for inflation purposes, then 25 to 27 pounds on the left side is a good starting place, and then 32 to about 35 pounds on the right side will get you where you want to go. But just keep in mind that while the car might feel better, it's actually slower. Then we move over to the miscellaneous settings, and you see really not a whole lot different there other than the grill tape, of course, which is down to 35%, mostly because I just didn't want to deal with it. And I knew that dropping it down even lower than I normally would certainly keep me in the good there with oil temp. And then finally, gear settings, you can see this is the lowest number that we've used on the rear end ratio, the 286, as opposed to a 3.0 in Xfinity or even a 294 in the truck. So that's just to bring the RPMs down some. But as I mentioned, if you're looking for single car performance, and particularly in the Cup cars where you have a shot at maybe getting closer to that pole, then play around with the rear end ratio and you can optimize some more speed for single car runs. So that's going to do it for Talladega. Hopefully you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much for joining me, and stay tuned as we will continue our support of NASCAR Heat 3.